Hi, I'm Lisa LaMotta, the Senior Editor of BioPharma Dive. We're here with Life Sci Public Relations and a great group of people at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference to talk about clinical trial design and drug development. And first, why don't we go down the line and introduce ourselves?
Okay, my name is Dominique Costantini. I am co-founder of Ouzren Immunotherapeutics and CEO of this company, and the field is autoimmune disease and immuno-oncology.
My name is Harmut. I'm the CEO of ABIVAX, a Paris-based company that actually targets the immune system to develop new treatments for viral diseases, for inflammatory diseases and cancer.
Hi, my name is Venkat. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vyome Biosciences. And so we are a dermatology drug development company, and we have this unique position of understanding microbial genetics that cause skin infections and their refractory and resistance nature. And we have a lead asset for acne, for moderate to severe acne, which is in phase 2 in the US.
Hi, I'm Osman Kibar. I'm the CEO and founder of Samumed, based out of San Diego, California. And we are focusing on regenerative medicine and oncology applications.
Hello, I'm Marty Rothera. I'm CEO of Therapeutics. Our vision is to be a global biotech that transforms the lives of patients with rare disorders through innovative gene therapy.
Hello, my name is Nawal Ouzren. I'm the CEO of Sensorion. We're a French biotech company that develops therapies for inner ear disorders, so vestibular disorders as well as hearing loss disorders.
Lisa, I'm Marty Driscoll. I'm the CEO and I'm the chairman of the board of Springbank Pharmaceuticals. We're a biopharmaceutical development company based outside Boston in the US. Our lead development compound is in a phase 2 trial for chronic hepatitis B. We develop small molecule nucleic acid hybrids that are primarily immunomodulators. Our second program is called a STING agonist, which we should be dosing our first humans early here in the second half of this year for certain cancers.
That's very exciting. I'd love to hear certainly from some of our European biotechs first, maybe, about how some of the regulatory changes here in the US have impacted your plans.
First, we think that the change that we have seen in the FDA in order to accelerate some development pathway is a good news. And due to the fact that we are working in immuno-oncology, we have a regular collaboration with FDA, and we have a phase 3 running, and the good reaction with agency in Europe and in US, because it's a trial Europe-US. The key question is the acceleration today of that we can say surrogate item in immuno-oncology is clear and very adapted. And that is something very important to have and to follow regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we also welcome the changes, on the FDA, particularly the number of approvals. In our space, hearing loss or vestibular pathology is actually rebuilding everything. So we are working very closely with the regulatory agencies to try to define what would make sense from a clinical trial perspective, and we welcome the collaboration that both agencies actually have set up for us.
Venkat, I imagine you have faced similar trials with developing pathways. It's not something like immuno-oncology being in acne.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty straightforward as far as we're concerned. US FDA has very clear guidance, and they also have some flexibility. And in general, they have been very progressive, in terms of pushing the drugs. But I think really in dermatology, in acne, the trials actually runs into multiple hundreds of patients. So there is a subjective element of what we call investigator global assessment. And that's where I think having the right sites, to avoid variability, and the right investigators, right training actually matters. So it's really an executional challenge more than anything to do with FDA.
And what about the upcoming Brexit has changed your plans, or how are you preparing for that as far as your clinical trial strategy, both for European biotechs and US biotechs?
Well, to be candid with you, pay little attention to it for the simple reason that you can't control it. What will be determined occurs, and we'll adjust our regulatory strategy and our development strategy accordingly. I mean, we're interested, of course, but we can't control it. We're a bit unusual in that we're a US-based company that's actually doing our first global clinical trials outside the United States.
Okay.
In hepatitis B, the prevalence is substantial globally, but it's really prevalent in Asia. So our first trials that we're doing, we're currently in our definitive phase 2 trials, are in Asia primarily. So we've just begun our discussions with the FDA and the EMA. We've been very collaborative. But frankly, because in our business, time is money. Patient enrollment has to go rapidly. Like even the large pharmas in this space go to Asia first. So we're actually doing our trials in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and in Vancouver and Toronto in Canada, where there are large Asian first immigrant populations. So we have a bit of an odd, if you will, scenario in that we're a US-based company doing our trials outside the US, but we'll come to the US later this year.
And do you have
So to your question around Brexit, I think we are just starting to see the changes that this will imply. We know that the EMA is now moving to Amsterdam from London, but to what extent this is going to impact sort of the clinical trial application process, conduct, etc., I think is something that we will need to see and that will evolve over the next couple of months and years.
And to second that, as far as EMA moving out of London and into Amsterdam, of course, in the short term, there's probably going to be some disruption, at least to the personnel, and therefore the operations. But I believe just over the last 48 hours, UK announced that they intend to remain in the EMA, both with respect to the regulations and the pricing strategies. So in that sense, in the long term, we do not anticipate any big disruption.
I guess that's good to hear.
We're London-based, but we also have a place here in the United States, here in California, and it really hasn't changed our clinical strategy in the sense that all we're concerned about is generating the evidence. And then we have, great collaborative conversations with EMA or FDA. But I think, like was just said, I think if there's anything that might occur is some kind of hiccup on scheduling meetings and so on as they transition out of London into Amsterdam.
We were using in our phase 3, this name is Voluntary Amana procedure. That means that we can have one country, and that was UK, in order to have the type of question for clinical trial. And that was very useful to use this technology without the Brexit impact, because that was in collaboration with all the countries in Europe.
Okay, interesting. And do you find that conducting clinical trials outside the US, at least your earlier trials, is easier or brings the data forward faster, is more efficient from a pricing standpoint, the cost?
Currently we have we're in the clinic in 8 different disease areas, and it's hard to apply a cookie-cutter approach to the whole list. There are certain indications where, for example, we prefer to go into phase 1 in Australia, and only after we go through the preliminary safety studies, we ended up bringing those programs back into the US. But as far as the decision to whether to bring it back into the US or not in the long run, I don't think there is any decision to be made. We still have to bring it back into the US because, ICH still governs the world of medicine, and US is still the leader in ICH. So if we don't bring a program back into the US, it raises some credibility issues.
Yeah, to build on that, you have like what you can do, from a regulatory perspective, and then what you can do to change standard of care. And you can actually potentially easily develop product outside the US. But then if you really want to have an impact on how medicine is practiced on the patients, you will have to bring with you the US KOLs. So at some point, strategically, for any company that really wants to be a leader in the space, that's going to be key.
Yeah. So in our case, even to understand the drug, understand the dose ranging study that one has to do in phase 2b, sometimes it may be actually worthwhile to do proof of concept human efficacy study outside US. Number one, it has a faster pathway to understand, and number two, it gives quick and perhaps at a lesser cost, the study, but in the US approved sites, to ensure quality, and then you can use that data to actually effectively design your US phase 2b. So in that sense, having that approach, can be faster and can also be cost effective.
And I guess in our case, we have a couple of considerations. One, if you're dealing with gene therapy, you really want to be dealing with top centers in the world that really know how to deal with gene therapy. So that's a primary consideration. For example, UCLA here, or Boston Children's Hospital, or Great Ormond Street in London. These are sort of places that we want to do the trial work. And then, of course, if you're dealing with rare diseases, you also need to have sort of specialized centers where you can access sufficient patients. So those are kind of the two key considerations. So it tends to be global.
And do any of you ever have trouble recruiting patients or finding these sites? What strategies are you using to make sure these are done efficiently and cost effective?
Well, we work on a few different fronts. First one is we try to balance the frontline physicians that do most of the prescribing and try to balance that population with the key opinion leaders, such that by the time the studies are over, we get a good mix of medical feedback from there. We also, early on in our development strategy, decided to hire our own CRA team, as well as CTAs, biostatistics. We brought everything in-house, such that we're able to establish a relationship with a certain clinical site, and we try to keep that relationship consistent by sending the same individuals to that site. And after a while, when we go back to them with repeat studies, there's a certain trust that forms between the site and us, and of course that helps in the recruitment.
I imagine you're unique in this group having that in-house. I'm sure a lot of you use contracting services to do a lot of your trials.
Yes.
Is it easy working with a lot of these CROs?
No.
What are the challenges?
This is my fourth company, biopharmaceutical development company that I've run as a CEO. And in almost every instance, the CROs, you have to use a global CRO if you're going to be in multiple countries. Of course you do. But my experience is all very much the same. As a small biopharmaceutical company, despite what they say to you when they're selling you their project, they give you little attention. And what really matters is the people on the ground in the organization. The people on the ground, the project managers, CRAs, the central lab, all is what matters. But in terms of strategic, senior management and all that, they're going to come in and tell you, my experience has been the same. We get much less attention than the large pharmas, where they have preferred vendor arrangements with, and the bulk of the revenue is generated in those organizations. But you manage it. You just understand that going in, and what you focus on is the local people that are actually the ones implementing your trial. That's what's most important in my judgment. But I don't see a lot of distinction in my history with, between the firms.
I mean, I'd like to build on that. I think one of the learnings in my career around this is, if you go back to your last question, in the rare disease field, in my last company, we recruited for 230 patients, requiring 58 centers in 18 countries. Wow. So that's complicated for a rare disease. And so it's difficult, in order to have that touch, you can't just rely on a third party that may have 20 clients that they're trying to satisfy. So I think it's very important to have your own team establish the relationship with those centers and the purpose and what's the whole point of this trial, and get them motivated. But in terms of the detailed execution around the trial, you have to rely on third parties. Because
and to build on that, in our case, in our hepatitis B trial, the recruitment has gone really well, and we're working one of the largest global CROs. But I would attribute it to my internal ClinOps team of 2, and really good people on the ground.
Yeah.
Project manager, the CRAs, so forth, very good. They're doing and motivated investigators. That oftentimes happens, as you know, in whatever disease state where they really want to meet the needs of their patients, where there's a high unmet need. In hepatitis B, there really isn't a functional cure yet today available. And physicians want to find that in their practices. So they're willing to put patients on, in the trial. So that has been a big benefit as well. But you can't simply outsource to a large CRO and hope everything goes well. That's delusional.
Well, I wanna take this thought and bring it sort of, at least for me, to the next level. When you talk about the CRO, it's really important that you realize what do you ask the CRO to do.
Yeah.
Because we have one element here, which is sort of the excitement of the site, which is the science that is behind it. These are things that you cannot source out, or that you cannot outsource. What we have to outsource, there's no question, as a company with 24 employees, what you have to outsource is the clinical operations part. And there you are dependent, and I agree with what you said before. It comes down to the project manager in the CRO who is responsible for your study. But the question around identifying the right study sites and generating the excitement about your trial, that depends on sort of the questions that you are asking. What is the potential medical need that you are addressing? And what are the data behind your ideas around the clinical trial, which has to come from the country. It has to come from the company. It has to come from your science, and it has to come from your relationships with the KOLs. CROs try to sell you that as well, but this is clearly something your chief medical officer has to know the people that are involved in the clinical trial. And working around this, I would say that the experience that we are having with CROs is actually very good.
Interesting. And has consolidation in the CRO space made these challenges greater?
No, I think the vision of CRO is, as you mentioned, to work with big pharma. But for biotech is a specific area that they have also an interest to be as rare disease or immuno-oncology is a field that they like also. Is big pharma and biotech working in the same area. The main role is investigator, because and key investigator of the trial. They have a role of what they say is to transmit the good sign in order to say that is interesting. And there's a lot of relationship between clinicians. They have a meeting in ESMO, in ASCO, and that is a good timing in order to have CRO involved, but also investigator involved in order to transmit the information that we need.
I like to add on to what you said, and also to previous question. I actually resonate with these people. I think one of the things that we fundamentally believe is an extensive training of investigators and motivation. Because in our kind of trial, dermatology, acne, firstly, there are multiple hundreds of people involved, patients. Then there is subjectivity involved. So there's a huge monitoring, what we call online dynamic monitoring, project management is very, very essential. But at the start of the study, to ensure that there is more consistency, and reduce the subjectivity, you need that extensive motivational training to both investigators and other staff in sites.
I mean, one can also work with smaller CROs. You don't always have to work with the really large organizations, and there are smaller CROs that really like to work in sort of more niche areas. And so at Orchard, we've deliberately chosen to work with a kind of an Orchard-sized CRO because we're not talking about hundreds of centers in this case. We're talking about very specialized centers and fewer of them, and that can be a very good relationship.
I want to add one last thing on the topic of CROs. in terms of quality control, in terms of consistency of the relationship, etc., I agree with everyone. In our case, because we had multiple programs that we could work on, we could justify it from a cost basis to build our own clinical operations team. And that actually helps us turn around the studies much faster. For example, our last phase 2 study, typically from the last patient, last visit to database lock, it can take as many as 2 to 3 months for big pharma, and for smaller biotechs, especially if the CROs are not giving them the attention they would like, it can go up to even further, up to 4 to 6 months. In our case, we were able to turn it around and lock the database within 48 hours after the last patient, last visit.
Wow.
Now, this is a huge luxury, especially for a small company, small biotech where every day matters.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the years and decades timeline that big pharma can afford.
Mm-hmm.
Time is money.
It is indeed.
So there is the time aspect of whether to go with a CRO or not, or do it in-house as well.
And what other strategies are each of you using to create better efficiencies, whether it's with patient recruitment or choosing sites or just even designing your trials?
So,
Echo.
well, one of the advantages of, I guess, working in the area of transformative medicine is that when you are completely changing the course of a patient's life, in our lead program, we have currently 100% survival rate in a disease where they normally die in the first 2 years of their life. And so you're completely changing that. So the advantage you can have in working in that kind of domain is you could use more of an adaptive trial design where you essentially don't have to keep inventing a next phase. I mean, compared to natural history, there is a dramatic difference. And so, you can find a quicker path which allows you to just seamlessly move from an early proof of concept into further evidence that you keep building on from that trial. And I think that this is actually a very good route for innovative medicines which make a big difference.
To build on that, coming from the rare disease as well, what we try to do is involve patient advocacy very early on, and particularly in the space of hearing loss, where when you look at standard of care, it's very poor. So what we try to do is really understand what's the patient journey, what matters to them, how do we really improve their quality of life, and from there, try to design trials considering these endpoints, and then pressure test with payers, and also try to influence the regulatory agencies to make sure that this makes sense. So bringing in, the patient view very early on, and then they are your best advocate as well, because they will also, put the information available so that when people are looking for options, a trial can be an option.
I'd like to repeat that last point, emphasize that. Because especially in today's regulatory environment, with the new commissioner and the new approach that FDA is taking, the pendulum is certainly swinging towards more risk tolerance at the FDA level. What that means is, especially for diseases that there isn't much of a precedence, FDA is also looking for guidance, and they're open for genuine scientific interaction. They don't know exactly what they would like. Whatever published guidance is typically decades old. So it makes it even more important to engage the key opinion leaders, patient advocacy groups, and other stakeholders, and keep each player in the know with respect to what everyone else is doing early and often. Then it's easier to build consensus and everybody's on the same page.
And how early are each of you working or tapping regulators to help with trial design? Is this happening before things get started? How involved are they in the conversation?
So we are always
Ladies first.
all right. So we currently have 2 products in the clinics. The first one is currently in phase 2B. It's being investigated for the most severe expression of vestibular pathology. It's called acute unilateral vestibulopathy. To design actually the trial, we had to discuss with the agencies very early on, and we actually created the primary endpoints. So we looked at different areas. We looked at pain because we thought it could be very relevant for our vertigo trial. And then we pressure tested, with patient advocates, and we said, if we measure this, does it change your quality of life? We discussed, with the doctors, is it clinically significant if we reduce, vertigo by 1 day or 2 days, or etc. And then with patient advocates, we were asking them, what does it mean, when you have something like that? And it was like so compelling for me to hear when some of them said, I'd rather give birth to a child without, without how do we call this, like the peridural?
Epidural.
Yeah, thank you. Rather than going for another.
I've been there, of course.
Yeah. You guys know what I'm talking about. Rather than having this acute crisis, and then you're like, okay, every day matters. Then in this case for them, they can't even stand up. So very early on, and regulatory is because even for them, they had no idea, and using parallels and patient groups and doctors.
I agree totally. When we are in that we can say specific area like immuno-oncology is new. That means after checkpoint, and checkpoint inhibitor as today standard of care, is nothing published, and our trial is after checkpoint failure. Then of course we can discuss about the endpoint of survival, but what is clinically meaningful when you have not literature in order to say that is the level? And then you discuss with expert, clinician, in order to say what is meaningful. And that is not easy to have this meaningful status. And after that, you present your meaningful vision to the agency, and they say yes, no, perhaps, but at the end, we agree about what we think in the endpoint.
I do think that it's very important to get in front of the FDA and EMA early. And sometimes when you're dealing sort of with frontier medicine, of course, it's in both parties' interest to share perspectives early. So cell and gene therapy is still a relatively new field. Mm-hmm. When you have 5-10 patients worth of data that already suggest you're changing the course of a disease, then I think it's also in both parties' interest to find a way to get it to patients relatively quickly, because the current trajectory of those patients is dramatic. And if you can really change that course, then time really matters. Mm. So again, I think it's a very constructive and sort of creative approach to what is required.
I think we probably all agree that it is important to engage into discussions with the regulators early on. I mean, there's no question about it. Particularly in biotech, I mean, we, for example, are in the HIV field, but we are not developing the 24th or the 25th antiviral that is actually knocking down the virus in the periphery, but is not going to the core where the disease is taking place, and this is the reservoir. If you look, there is no published guidance from either the FDA or the EMA on what should endpoints for this study, what kind of endpoints you should choose for your studies. Therefore, again, the critical interaction is the science, and actually I include clinical research into that. Today we always talk about clinical development, but as a matter of fact, we are going from data point to data point, because what we are achieving today or what we are seeing today is going to define the clinical trial that we are starting tomorrow. And that is only possible if we keep the relationships at a very high frequency with the regulators, inform them about the data we have, and then move on.
I like the clinical research thing, because beyond the primary endpoint, what we try to understand also is like how is the disease evolving, and biomarkers are also now more and more important, I think, to include, because you really know if you're impacting the natural state of the disease or not. So I think it's important.
Yeah, just to add on to what she's saying, I think it's to understand the full NDA program when you do your pre-IND meeting. And it's beyond clinical. You'll get a lot of insights with respect to the toxicology program as well. And even within clinical, there have been changes in our case with acne in terms of reducing the age of the patient from 12 years to 9 years. So it's a good learning from a point of view how perspectives are changing in US FDA, so that for us to prepare what kind of patient pool that we should be targeting.
We're fortunate in the last year and a half in hepatitis B that the two major medical societies in the field, the American Liver Diseases and the European Liver Diseases, convened with industry, FDA, and EMA a summit for 2 days in September of 16. And a consensus panel issued a publication from that to give guidance to the industry on what will be the key determinants of functional cure in hepatitis B. In particular, the FDA, led by the division director, who was physically present with many of her senior staff and the EMA at the meeting, the 2-day conference, said, we will accept a certain marker, surrogate marker, drawn from blood, as an endpoint, acceptable endpoint for definition of efficacy and functional cure. That's very big for us, because it gives a guidance to the industry on what endpoints we need to study in our pivotal programs. So it's been very collaborative. I can't say enough about the FDA and the EMA for participating in that and giving guides. Now, you then have to go forth and have your end of phase 2, your pre-IND, your end of phase 2, discuss your own trial design, because there's modifications given in your own therapy and what you're studying. But at least generally, we understand. So in our phase 2 program, to say, can we determine POC, proof of principle, we'll know better, even before we go into our pivotal trial design. So we're fortunate in hepatitis B. I worry a lot about oncology, though. That keeps me up at night thinking about going into the clinic in oncology, and for a whole series of reasons, not the least of which is trying to accrue patients in the trials. With so many trials globally, you may have more experience since you're in the clinic.
Yes, in immuno-oncology we are facing a big revolution, because for the first time we are working on a new checkpoint domain, that means a myeloid checkpoint.
Right.
And the revolution is because we are not thinking about indication, but about type of inflammatory aspect that you can find, a cold or hot tumor. And that is completely new. And registration, as an example, in MSC, that is the name of microsatellite instability, not limited to one cancer, but open for other cancer, is a big revolution, because that is the first time that we are not thinking about indication, but about vision of the tumor microenvironment. And that is very exciting to be in this area now.
I concur. We're fortunate in viral diseases in some way. I don't know if those on the panel familiar with the area would agree in that. Typically, when you're measuring efficacy in viral infectious diseases, they're very objective measures. You're drawing from the blood. It's hard to have a placebo effect, like you were considering pain in your trials. I ran a pain company. You can be influenced your endpoints by a placebo effect. Typically, phase 2 data is highly predictive of pivotal trial results in most viral infectious diseases, oftentimes. So we're fortunate in that sense. But now oncology is evolving.
Yes.
It's evolving right in front of us. And that keeps me up at night as we think about what will be our endpoints in our trials.
Well, but I would say the viral area is evolving as well. I mean, it's not only the measurement of the virus in the blood, because the patients that we are dealing with, they have no measurable virus in the blood. They have a reservoir where the virus has integrated its genetic material, and that is something that is sort of at a different scale, measurable.
I should clarify myself, not in the case of the latent virus there, but in the case of, in HPV, there's, they're replicating massive quantities of the virus, so you can clearly measure that. Now, of course, there's a reservoir in HPV as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and that's the holy grail for you as well, I would suppose.
Right. Yep. And that was the guidance we were getting from the agency and the FA on the EMA on how to measure that. What would be the markers on measuring that, which is very helpful to us.
Exactly. And as you said, you had the discussion with FDA some time ago. We are seeing exactly the same discussion now between FDA and the key opinion leaders coming up in 2 or 3 weeks from now.
Right.
And I think one of the opportunities in the discussion and the dialogue with the regulators is if you've got an effect size that is significant, is avoiding the need for placebo. And, finding a way to get to a registration where you're really basing that on published natural history or natural history that is well documented elsewhere, and therefore avoiding the need of putting patients on placebo. So I think that this is a really big advantage if you can find a route with the regulators where maybe you've identified some important centers which have well-documented natural history. That is something that you can look at, and I think that's very advantageous in terms of speed to market.
One thing to add on this topic, I think we all agree that we would love to talk to the agency early and often, and as long as they're willing to return our calls, because there's no downside. The more we learn about their feedback, the better we can plan, the smarter we get, the smarter they get, so on and so forth. Obviously, sometimes they have other things to do. So in those cases, at least from our development timeline perspective, what we try to do, what we target is the moment we have a lead nomination, for example. So we're within a year, 15 months of an IND application. That's when we start putting together our advisory board. And that includes, of course, the physicians, key opinion leaders, but we also make sure to include former FDA personnel in that board, such that whenever we can ask the FDA for their feedback and whatever they can tell us, great. But whenever they don't know what they have in mind, they would like to see more data before committing to a certain path. In those cases, we try to have individuals with similar experience who has sat on the other side of the table with us, trying to allow us to make more informed speculative decisions.
Regulators and payers often have very different goals and are looking for different things when it comes to clinical trials and endpoints. How do you take that into consideration and incorporate that into your trial design?
It's very important. More and more today we have to go beyond just regulatory approval. It's like, is the product going to be reimbursed and at least a price you consider acceptable? So, I'm coming from the big pharma world where sometimes we believed we could actually get the good price and we got our teeth broken. So now it's extremely important in Europe, in particular because they have very formal pricing and reimbursement process. But even in the US, I think it's becoming, a hot topic to be able to demonstrate you can bring value for the patients and justify the price.
One item that they are also open to consider is the definition of responder patient. If you can select a subpopulation well, and then to define that the interest is very big for this specific population, or we have no interest in the other rest of the population, that create for regulatory and behind regulatory market access something that is a real pathway in order to discuss with agencies.
I think we're seeing more and more there's a kind of connection between the regulators and the HTA bodies that allows you to even have joint discussions about what is required, not just for the approval, but in fact to get reimbursement. So that,
you got that? Yeah.
Well, there are sort of pilot projects, particularly in Europe, where they're trying to bring, because you can imagine Europe is all those different countries with all their different systems, and they're trying to sort of find a way to harmonize this more and more so that you've got one HTA evaluation, but also a joined-up thought about what's required for approval and for reimbursement.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So in our case, I think, so when you're designing a phase 2B or let's say eventually a pivotal phase 3, I think both the aspects have to be taken into consideration. FDA has a standard guidance, let's say in the case of acne. So there are certain goals that you need to achieve to get an approval from them. But when you already have existing drugs in the marketplace, you need to design your trial in a manner that you get the endpoints better than them. So for payers to accept premium pricing. So I think that it has to be thought through pretty carefully, and it's not always necessary, particularly in our case, how FDA thinks, the payer thinks.
I would say between the regulators and the payers, they both try to minimize risk, but they do define risk differently. In the case of the FDA, when they talk about risk, we're talking about medical risk, safety, side effects, patient, risk to the patients.
Right.
Whereas in the case of payers, they have their actuary tables, they have to follow all the financials, obviously. So their risk is more about minimizing uncertainty.
Yeah.
So whether the drug is going to work in what % of the population of the patients, and whether you can predict that with biomarkers or otherwise, that's the kind of products that they love, because that helps them minimize their risk in terms of future reimbursement and whether they are getting what they're paying for in the form of drugs.
I imagine many of you have partners that you work with or partnering your drugs. How amenable are some of the big pharma partners with working collaboratively on trial design and bringing programs forward? I imagine you have a unique perspective on this.
Yes, we have two big partners in place, and we have something that the relationship are very easy because we are not only from biotech, we were also in pharma before. That explains that we understand the type of language that they have. And the pharma vision is to be sure that we obtain all the regulatory stamp and to prepare that in the CMC part and to have the opportunity for the clinical aspect to discuss all the elements. And then that is very fluid relationship in this aspect.
Well, I think then you've got to be pretty lucky.
Yes.
I think you've got to be pretty lucky because
perhaps.
having been on the other side and knowing how large pharma companies take their portfolio decisions, it's not a given that even if you meet sort of what you agreed with, is still on top of the list
Yes.
of the pharma company. And I think we see it quite often that internal considerations, internal struggles for money or how to distribute the available R&D funding to existing programs. I think sometimes the smaller companies is taking the short end of the straw and may not exactly see the development funded by the company in the way they foresaw it in the beginning.
Yes, but we can manage this uncertainty with the advance of the project. If the project is that means running well in the type of development, even the strategy of the pharma change, we are prepared to find another pharma partner.
That's the point. I think we agree on that.
Diversification or risk diversification.
I mean, we don't have any large pharma partners at this point, but in my last company we did in a rare disease. And on the one hand, it was great to have all the resources. On the other hand, you have all the processes that large pharmaceutical companies have. And so, on the one hand, you have a highly focused, very nimble biotech type of environment. On the other hand, you're trying to fit with a rather more slower, deliberate process. And the consequence in that situation was that other competitive offerings from smaller biotechs were catching up faster.
Yeah.
So that's the
I would absolutely support that. That is certainly one of the downsides of the partnering, and for which reason we decided we will, as long as we have money, try to draw this out as long as possible, that we are not dependent on these processes, one step forward, two steps back, that we are seeing in the large companies.
It being JP Morgan week, I imagine all of you are here for just that reason. I'd love to hear about some of your experiences talking to other companies this week.
We are only participating in Life Sci, so we are locked in here. We are locked in the Drake Hotel for 3 full days and have no discussions with pharma.
That is not true.
That is absolutely true.
This is my 17th JP Morgan. I look much younger than I am.
Started when you were
What has amazed me over the years, and it's probably not a surprise to any of you here, is that how much goes on more and more outside the conference. I haven't stepped inside the actual JP Morgan conference in 4 years. I think I presented there last in 2009. It is remarkable. I don't think I think it's relatively rare that you get a deal done here, but it's all about putting a face to a name, building the relationship, starting the discussion, or continuing the discussion. And in our case, as a publicly traded biopharmaceutical company, we rely on the equity capital markets primarily. You're always raising capital. Yeah. Whether you are or not, you're always raising capital. So the bulk of our meetings are with prospective or existing investors. And it's very productive. I must say it's very productive. They're able to hear your story, you point out the milestones that you're seeking towards. So then later in the year, if you hit those, it just enhances your credibility. So it's a very, very, although it's crazy, you're going from 6 in the morning until 11:30 at night, you can't beat it for in most cases, for the interactions you have and how that you can build your business. And I think it's actually, in an odd way, I think it's even more productive than it was perhaps 7 or 8 years ago because of who comes and the volume of people come and the diversity of people that come. That's just my own personal experience.
Yeah, I agree with him. And it's a great place to actually meet with investors. As a private company, you're always raising funds. And it's not necessarily that you're always pitching, but there's socializing, there's building relationship. And same is the case with some of the partners. So it's a great place to be in, actually.
You asked about partnerships too. I think that I echo entirely what you guys have just said. And with respect to the area of gene therapy, there is a lot of interest. So we do get a lot of inbound inquiries around the potential to maybe license in a program and so on. And it is an area that can evolve very fast because with a few patients worth of data, you know quite quickly whether you have something that's really having an effect. So it could be that you end up by taking on more than you can cope with as a small biotech to start with, in which case partnerships could be useful.
And we don't have a partnership at the moment, but for multiple programs, we are talking to a ridiculously high number of potential partners. And the one benefit of JP Morgan, in my opinion, is, of course, it's like speed dating. There is no way you can end up with a transaction after a half-hour meeting. But I think it is very helpful to eliminate those that do not have the genuine interest, such that you go through everyone. You can quickly weed out the ones you don't think are going to get anywhere, such that you can focus on the few remaining and then get into deeper discussions with them.
So we'll get quick yeses or nos.
The no's are more valuable than the yeses.
In the partnership area, I entirely agree. In hepatitis B, it's believed by many, including ourselves, that really for a patient to clear the virus, you have to reawaken the immune system. Our compound is an immunomodulator in the liver, so we think we have this hypothesis that ours will have to be in the middle of any combinatorial treatment. So we're very big on collaborating in clinical development. We have a collaboration with Gilead, with their nukes. We have one with an siRNA company. We have one with a capsid company, because we want to demonstrate that we need to be in the middle of any of that. But I'm very sensitive to diluting my asset. It's clinical collaborations. Even what we do with Gilead is just around the clinical trial. They have really no rights. And it goes back to one of the points made, is that I'd rather raise our capital in the equity capital markets, if I can, all things being equal, as opposed to raising it in a non-dilutive base from pharma, where now I have the trips. Wait until the valuation's higher, wait until you need them. That all said, I worry in oncology. Because to me, the domain, it's becoming more and more a large pharma domain because of the cost and even accessing the checkpoint inhibitors for trials. Is a daunting. There I might be a little more open-minded, despite the fact, as you said, working with a large organization has dramatic challenges. But you have to balance it with the area you're in and the realities of the areas you're in. But generally, I'd rather, when I think of shareholder dilution, I also think of asset dilution. and not wanting to dilute the asset that I regret down the road.
Yeah.
And there's one other topic that maybe if we have a few minutes mention. What has really intrigued me in the last few months is China.
Yes.
If I could just talk about that for a moment, is many of you are probably familiar, the Chinese government is stating they're going to modify regulations, and it has the potential to allow for Western medicines to come to China and get to market sooner.
Yeah.
Where they'll actually accept pivotal trial data from outside China. We're getting inundated. Now, of course, hepatitis B, it's estimated that 9% of the adult population has chronic HBV in China. Now, do the math, it's massive. So we're getting all this inbound, but it's interesting, you know, because of the mindset of their deal types with what those of us in the room might do. But it is fascinating to me to see how that evolves, because it does seem to me that the government does want to make the pathway for Western medicines faster, more rapid. That's my impression. I'll see if reality actually comes to fruition with that, but it isn't. I don't know if others have that experience at all, or whether your treatments lend themselves to that market. I don't know.
No, to build on that, I think that's one of the biggest news, that China actually is willing to consider non-Chinese, pivotal trials for approval. There were even 2 innovative drugs that got reimbursed in China, which is a major milestone as well. And we are also being approached by many local Chinese companies. They are really trying to in-license, assets, innovative assets for the market. So let's see how it goes.
Well, I mean, I think that's a really exciting place to sort of wrap things up. It's nice to hear that everyone's so enthusiastic about other places and moving their drugs forward and working with regulators. And I thank you all for all your insights today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.